Of all of these, a particular list of things, categories of stuff, from where stuff comes from, the cheapest stuff, the stuff in which are the most replaceable, stuff that you have multiples of, would be pretty much the clothing and shoes, particularly women. Anyway, so when we think about textiles, clothing, those are great examples of a particular task, a particular industry in which much of the cost for companies is in labor. People stitching T-shirts and Nikes, people dyeing and cutting bandanas, people packaging your underbridges. All of that is very simple tasks in which you require a large percent of your costs are from the laborers. So because of that, you're going to find cheap labor. And so we think about, of all of our stuff, from our list of where our stuff comes from. Here's just a list that I randomly picked from someone a few semesters ago. So here we see some pretty predictable patterns. At the top, the clothing and shoes. Simple things. Things that are fairly lightweight. You're going to find those in the lower income countries. And so it's all about finding cheap labor. And so when we look at a lot of the manufacturers, especially of simple things, simple electronics, or clothing items, they find cheap labor. And so we can see this when we look at the geographical shift as far as where we find, as far as where our t-shirts are made, where our clothing items are made. Early on in the United States, it was New England. So early in the early U.S. history, so the 1700s and 1800s, New England dominated as far as the textile industry in the United States. Why? Because a lot of inventions up there. People inventing new ways to manufacture clothing items. See the Industrial Revolution. We've beaten that to death. Let's go ahead and move on. So over time, what happened was these New Englanders, they started to say, you know what, we want higher wages. They started to develop unions and form unions, and so the factories started developing unions, and so they did. The workers said, we want better working conditions. We want higher wages. So essentially what the textile companies did is like, all right, we'll just move somewhere else. And so they moved for cheaper labor. Go figure. So what they did was they found cheaper labor available in the South. First off, people demanded a little bit lower wage, not as high as educated as those in the New England areas. So they were less educated, so had less skills. But more importantly, they were non-union. So they weren't going to demand better working conditions. So what happened over time is the 1800s and 1900s, then the particular areas of the South, for example, Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, see a lot of these rural towns in which they had these mills in which they would just crank out a bunch of clothing. Also had a lot of cotton nearby as well. And so what we have is we have the quest for cheap labor. Now do we have stuff as far as our clothing items made in the Carolinas and Georgia? No, because it's moved somewhere else. Latin America, Caribbean areas, Southeast Asia. Once again, see your assignment 2 in your clothing and shoes lists.